Was George Robbins murdered in this cottage? Robbins was a tough man in a tough business. He made enemies. 6 months ago he disappeared. He's not been seen since, either dead or alive. At Fulchester Crown Court, the trial of Harold Barnes continues. Barnes has been accused of murdering Robbins. Robbins, it was rumoured, had an affair with Barnes' wife. The prosecution say Barnes killed him because of it. Barnes maintains Robbins is still alive, that he faked his death to swindle the insurance companies and find money to get out of some business trouble. The prosecution has begun its cross-examination of Harold Barnes, and Jonathan Fry, QC, has just created a sensation by calling for George Robbins to appear in court.
George Robbins, please. Call George Robbins, please.
My lord, if I may intrude upon my learned friend's charade, may I ask what this is all about?
Mr. Fry, what do you mean by your irregular call for George Robbins to appear?
I apologise, my lord.
I would like an explanation rather than an apology.
Lord, my learned friend has said that he is not seeking to prove that George Robbins is still alive. On the contrary, he is prepared to accept evidence put before the court in support of the assumption that Robbins is dead.
Well?
The only person to question this has been the defendant, Barnes. Yet when I appear to accept his view and make as if to call Robbins into the court, Barnes is the only person in the court who does not turn to look at what to anyone else would be a remarkable appearance. Why? Because I submit he knows that Robbins is dead.
I just wasn't stupid enough to believe Robbins had been found, that's all.
Very well, Mr. Fry. I'm prepared to overlook your unseemly behaviour on this occasion. But kindly remember that I'm extremely averse to theatricals in my court.
Thank you, Lord. You have said that you're a car thief.
But not a murderer.
One thing at a time. And on the 6th and 7th of August this year, you were in Scotland with your wife, delivering a stolen car.
Yeah.
You told this to the court here today.
Right.
But you didn't tell the police when you were charged with murder.
No.
Why not? It was an alibi supported by your wife. As Inspector Robert told the court, the fact that you had no alibi increased the suspicion that you were the man the police were seeking.
I just didn't believe I'd be charged. And I wasn't going to be conned into admitting that I'd nicked a car and involved my wife with it, eh?
But you were charged.
Yeah, when I'd refused to give an alibi.
Which you spent the last few months polishing up before delivering it here in court.
It's up to you to disprove my alibi, not for me to prove it.
I see you know the law.
I do, so don't you try and stone me.
You were not, however, so well informed, and you were cautioned. You can't do anyone for murder if there isn't a body. The fact is, Mr. Barnes, you can.
That's why I keep saying Robbins is still alive.
And what do you mean by that?
Look, you find Robbins dead, and no matter who did it, you'll pin it on me. Because of me threatening him and all that. You find him with a belly full of bullets, and I don't stand a chance. But so far, no one has said that definitely Robbins is dead, have they? I mean, all this stuff about evidence.
Barnes,
Evidence.
the jury will eventually decide whether the evidence is sufficient to assume that he is dead.
Yeah, assume. That's what it's all about, isn't it? Assuming he's dead. So he disappears for 6 months. So who wouldn't? I've told you already. He had his hand in the till. He was found with it. I'd do the same myself if I was in his shoes.
Mr. Barnes, I'm not going to debate the issue of Robbins' present whereabouts with you.
No, you don't have to, do you? You can just assume he's dead. It's all very well for you, but it's not for me, is it?
You delayed giving an alibi because you never thought you would be charged with murder. Is that right?
Right.
But now that you have been charged, out comes this story about delivering stolen cars in Scotland. In the company of your wife, who was with you on a kiss and make-up weekend.
That's the truth.
And that's the truth, is it? Then why don't you go one stage further?
What do you mean?
Where did you stay in Scotland?
I'm not saying.
A single entry in an hotel register would verify your alibi.
Oh, we didn't stay in a hotel.
How very unfortunate.
Look, you don't drive nicked cars around and leave a trail of bloody crews behind you, do you?
I'm in no position to say, Mr. Barnes, but I'll take the word of an expert thief.
Oh, 6 and stones will break my bloody bones,
Behave
mate.
yourself.
Listen, why is it the only one in this court who's not allowed to make a joke is me?
Nobody is making jokes.
This old trouser joke.
Are you prepared to submit to cross-examination or are you not?
Oh, go ahead. I've got nothing else on.
You said earlier that you did not kill George Robbins.
I'm still saying it.
Because so you said, You didn't intend to rot in jail because of him.
Right.
So despite the threat you issued, leave my wife alone or I'll kill you, make the most of it because you won't live to collect. Despite making these threats, which you admit you meant seriously, you did not really intend to fulfill them.
My wife convinced me that she had not been having it off with Robbins. She convinced me that she was telling the truth.
And so to make it up to her, you took her on a joyride to Scotland in a stolen car.
Yeah.
When did you first learn that Robbins had disappeared?
A couple of weeks later.
A couple of weeks after August the 7th?
Yeah, about.
And how did you learn of it?
Gossip, got around.
And when were you first aware how bad it could be for you?
Not till the coppers called.
You had an alibi. Or so you said. Oh, yes, of course, I forgot you didn't intend to use it. Are we to assume, then, that you prefer to be tried for murder rather than theft?
I'm waiting for you to prove that Robbins is dead. You find his body and you prove that I did it.
You killed Robbins. You disposed of his body so well that you have the confidence to say that. Find his body and then prove that I did it.
You can't prove nothing, and it's bugging the hell out of you.
You acted on the assumption of no body, no trial. And then you found that you were wrong. And that is bugging you, Mr. Barnes.
We'll see. We'll see if they believe he's dead. He's not. He's alive.
Be quiet.
I mean, you've got Kirby, the biggest liar in the business, and his ex-wife who wants to cover the insurance
Remove
to
the
say
prisoner from
that
the
they've not
witness
seen him
box.
for so long that he must be dead. And you call that proof? It's the biggest fraud in the world. And you think this isn't a joke? It's a bloody farce, mate.
I have the power to order this trial to continue in your absence if you persist in this behaviour. Are you going to control yourself? Mr. Elliot.
I wish to call Mrs. Katherine Barnes.
Mrs. Katherine Barnes, please.
What is your religion?
Church of England.
Take the testament in your right hand and read aloud the words on the card.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
So, Katherine Barnes, you live at 72 Arbroath Crescent, Fulchester,
Yes,
and you're the wife of the defendant, Harold Barnes.
yes.
Are you acquainted with George Robbins?
I know him, yes.
Do you know him well?
He bought me a drink now and then.
You went out with him from time to time.
A few times.
Was your husband aware of this?
Not at the time, no.
Did he find out later?
Yes.
Mrs. Barnes, I have to ask you this question. Did you sleep with George Robbins?
No. No, he wanted me to, but I refused.
Was Robbins angry when you rejected him?
Very.
What did he say?
He said he'd tell Harry we'd already been having an affair.
Did he in fact tell your husband that you and he had been sleeping together?
Yes.
What was your husband's reaction?
He threatened he'd kill him if he didn't leave me alone.
And presumably you tried to convince him that Robbins was lying.
Yes, of course I did.
Did he believe you?
I think he wanted to. But every time he ran into George Robbins and his friends, they started saying things. They rubbed it in that me and George had. Well, they got him mad.
Coming now to the weekend of August the 6th, the weekend that Robbins disappeared.
Yes.
What happened between you and your husband?
I managed to convince him that George Robbins had been lying about me. He said he had a job that coming weekend, driving up to Scotland, and that we should get rid of the kids with my sister and drive up there together.
And did you?
Yes,
When did you leave Fulchester?
Friday afternoon.
Now, that would be August the 6th.
Yes,
When did you get back?
Sunday night.
Mrs. Barnes, were you with your husband the entire time that weekend?
Every minute.
Thank you. No further questions.
Will you tell us where you stayed in Scotland?
No,
Why not?
I just can't.
If you did and could prove it, your husband would almost certainly be acquitted of the charge he now faces.
Harry's told me I mustn't say.
For fear of incriminating others in the car theft business? I can send you to prison if you don't answer the question.
You say there is no truth in the rumours about you and George Robbins,
They weren't true.
and that after much persuasion you convinced your husband that they weren't true.
Yes.
after which his attitude towards George Robbins altered immediately.
He still hated him.
Well, quite. As he himself has said, when he threatened his life, he meant it. But come the weekend of the 6th and 7th of August, when George Robbins disappeared, your husband no longer had any wish to kill George Robbins, because by then you had convinced him that the stories weren't true.
That's right.
What a fortunate last-minute conversion.
That's what happened, whether you like it or not.
Why did you agree to let Robbins take you out in the first place?
I saw nothing wrong with it.
But he must have known his reputation as a ladies' man. Everyone else did.
I can look after myself.
So you went with Robbins, knowing that if you did, and your husband found out, he would be extremely angry.
I saw nothing wrong with having a drink with him.
Didn't you?
No.
In public?
Always in public.
Where all the world could see you with a notorious womanizer. You couldn't see anything wrong in that.
I really don't care what people think.
Not even when those same people could go and tell your husband the minute he came home?
I had nothing to hide.
Is it not the case, Mrs. Barnes, that you did have an affair with George Robbins? That your husband found out, that you didn't care that he found out? That he went after Robbins and threatened to kill him if he didn't stop seeing you? That you continued to encourage Robbins to pay attention to you? So that your husband fulfilled his threat, followed him down to Treefell Cottage and there murdered him?
None of that's true.
Is it not also true that finding yourself without a lover, you agreed to help your husband by supporting his cock and bull yarn about a reconciliation and a weekend spent in Scotland?
We were in Scotland the day George Robbins is meant to have been killed.
And yet so strong is honour among thieves that you won't find anybody in Scotland to bear out your story for fear of implicating them. You put their welfare before that of your husband, who, if convicted, stands to spend the rest of his life in prison.
We were in Scotland the day George Robbins disappeared.
I have no more questions to put to this witness, my lord.
You may go.
That concludes the case for the defence, my lord.
Thank you.
Please, Your Lordship. Members of the jury, the prosecution in this case has sought to establish two things. Firstly, that George Robbins is dead. Secondly, that he was murdered by the defendant, Harold Barnes. It is our submission that George Robbins met his death on Friday the 6th of August last year, that he was shot, and that his body was transported to a place from which to date it has not been recovered. Now, you will recall the following facts. On two occasions, the defendant, Harold Barnes, threatened George Robbins in public. Contact my wife again and I will kill you. You've heard that signs of a violent struggle were found at Robbins's country cottage. An eyewitness described how she saw a car, like Barnes's car, leave the cottage driven by a man with dark hair and long sideburns. Note that this description was given weeks before the defendant was apprehended. And you will notice that the defendant has dark hair and long sideburns. And then we heard the evidence of the forensic expert. Fibres from a carpet found in Robbins's cottage were detected in Barnes's shoes. And from the police, we heard that although he maintained he'd never been anywhere near the place in his life, he had in fact paid a parking fine, not 2 miles from there. He also claimed that he had no gun. Why then was he in possession of ammunition? And finally, the most incriminating of all members of the jury, we come to the defendant's alibi. Whilst refusing to disclose his whereabouts on Friday the 6th of August to the police when he was charged with murder, he waits until he comes to this court to say that he took a trip to Scotland which covered this period. A trip, members of the jury, witnessed only by his wife. Now, you'll recall the defendant's word when he was asked why he diverged from the tactics of his counsel and maintained that Robbins is still alive. He said that if it were proved that Robbins were dead, he, Barnes, wouldn't stand a chance, that he would be convicted because of the evidence against him, even though he maintained that he didn't kill Robbins. And there, members of the jury, we have the truth of the matter. If Robbins is dead, even the defendant agrees there is sufficient damning evidence to prove that he killed him. Counsel for the defence, in their attempt to show that Robbins was killed not by the defendant but by some unknown group of business rivals, have been unable to offer any proof at all They could only refer to some hostility between these unknown gentlemen and Robbins over the 15 months prior to Robbins's disappearance. But this in no way substantiates the claim that anyone other than Barnes had any desire to kill Robbins. No, members of the jury, it is our submission that the facts given before you prove quite clearly that Harold Barnes, incensed by his wife's affair with Robbins, followed Robbins to Treefell Cottage, murdered him, removed the body to a place where it has remained hidden, and then assumed wrongly that he could never be tried for murder as long as the body was not found. There he made his mistake. And it is that mistake, members of the jury, which will make sure that he is rightly convicted of the crime with which he is charged.
Please, my lord. Members of the jury. Let me, in summing up, ask you first to consider what my learned friend has just maintained is true. Harold Barnes decides to murder George Robbins because of jealousy. On the evening of August 6th, he drives his own car to Robbins' country cottage. He shoots Robbins 3 times before bundling his body into his car and removing it elsewhere. He then sits around and waits for the police to catch up with him, which he knows they will, for he has on more than one occasion threatened his life in public. Now, when they do, he withholds an alibi story because the alibi involves a fiction about delivering a stolen car to Scotland. Members of the jury, whatever conclusions you may have arrived at concerning the character of the defendant, you cannot possibly believe him to be such a fool. If nothing else, and I repeat, if nothing else, Harold Barnes is cunning. He has to be. His occupation demands it. Now, would this professional criminal plan and execute a murder and then concoct as an alibi a story that he was unable to substantiate? I mean, surely he would have planned an alibi that was unshakable. Playing cards all weekend, fishing with 3 companions, anything. Now, this is the most incredible assumption made by the prosecution in their attempt to prove that the defendant is guilty of this alleged murder. Now, there are, of course, other assumptions. Would a professional and expert car thief drive his own car to the scene of a crime? Now, what did he do? Did he draw off a Robbins' blood before he put his body in the car? It seems unlikely. The forensic expert stated that he could furnish no conclusive proof that the fibres found in the defendant's shoes matched those of the doormat in Robbins' cottage. I don't intend to spend any time debating the seriousness of finding an unused box of 6-year-old bullets. Barnes said at the time he had never owned a gun. This has not been disproved. As we've said, we do not rely solely on contesting the evidence that George Robbins is no longer alive. We have proceeded to give what is evidence of a reasonable doubt as to the guilt of the defendant. Now, Mrs. Barnes has stated that by August the 6th, her husband had no interest in carrying out his threat to murder Robbins. He was at that time convinced of the falseness of the rumours which had first aroused his anger. So, he and his wife drove to Scotland to deliver a stolen car. Now, Barnes has made no secret of his activities as a car thief, and his wife supports this account of the trip. And the very nature of the business has made it impossible for Barnes to furnish a witness. Now, this is worthy of note. Barnes was willing to face the serious charge of murder rather than give the name of the person or persons who could exonerate him of this charge. My learned friend has suggested that there is honour among thieves. Well, I put it to you that if you reject this cliché approach, you'll find that fear among thieves plays a far greater role than honour. The eyewitness. Now, she has referred to the man she saw driving away from the cottage on August the 6th as being unidentifiable, save for the fact that he had dark hair and long sideburns. Now, remember, this description was given to the police weeks before Barnes was first interviewed. Members of the jury, look around this courtroom. There are many people who fit that description, including Inspector Robert. Members of the jury, my submission, the evidence has shown that George Robbins may have been killed on August the 6th last. but there is clearly insufficient evidence to place the blame for their killing on the head of the defendant, Harold Barnes. Thank you, my lord.
Thank you, Mr. Elliot. Now, members of the jury, it is now my duty to advise you on points of law and to remind you of the evidence. It is for you alone to decide what you believe and whether the charge against Harold Barnes has been proved or not. In a case where a person is accused of murder, but the body of the victim has not been produced, the law requires the prosecution to present positive evidence that a murder has in fact taken place. This evidence will, of course, be circumstantial. However, a combination of events can be sufficient to conclude that a person has met his death. In the case of George Robbins, you have heard that he never failed to visit his children on every Saturday of the year. Since the week of his disappearance, he has never once done so. Secondly, you've heard that he had been expected to attend a very important business meeting the week after he disappeared. He did not attend it. Thirdly, you have heard the evidence of the bloodstains which were found in Robbins's country cottage. Bloodstains of the same group as Robbins's own blood. And lastly, members of the jury, you have heard that since August the 6th, no one has heard from or seen George Robbins again. Now, you may well feel that these circumstances are sufficient to prove that he is dead. But if, however, you feel that Robbins is still alive, then you have no alternative but to bring in a verdict of not guilty. However, I would urge you to consider very carefully the evidence brought forward to the view that he is dead. And if you decide to your own satisfaction that he is dead, it will then be your duty to decide whether Harold Barnes is guilty of his murder. The defense has sought to show that there were other parties bent on taking his life, whereas the prosecution has presented a case which seeks to eliminate any reasonable doubt whatsoever from the charge that Barnes is guilty. You must choose between them. Now, one final word of advice. You will, of course, have noted that Barnes is a self-confessed thief who has lived most of his adult life among criminals. But I must remind you that you are not here to judge him on what his previous life has been. You are simply required to consider the evidence you have heard and to decide whether this man murdered George Robbins. In conclusion, I will remind you that the 2 points which the prosecution must establish beyond reasonable doubt are these. 1, that George Robbins is dead. 2, that Harold Barnes killed him. And now, members of the jury, you will kindly retire and consider your verdict.
The court will rise. Bring up the prisoner. The prisoner will remain standing. All stand. Members of the jury, will your foreman please rise? Just answer this question, yes or no. Have you reached a verdict upon which you are all agreed?
Yes.
Do you find the prisoner at the bar, Harold Barnes, guilty or not guilty of the charge of murder?
Not guilty.
Very well. Harold Barnes, you have been found not guilty. You are free to leave the court.
All stand.
Next week, join another jury in assessing the facts when our cameras return to watch another leading case in the Crown Court.